The militia of the several states differ from other institutions like the standing army, police, and other organizations in community defense in that they are a constitutionally mandated body of the people in arms. Much like the jury, you only trust the people themselves with judgment over their fellow man. You also trust the people themselves with their own security, with securing a free state. And as the Constitution makes clear in the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia is necessary for the security of a free state.
Perhaps the best way to describe the militia is to begin with an explanation of what it is not. The militia is not the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Air Force, or even the troops. It's not the National Guard, Coast Guard, or the police. It's also not some vigilante group, UN peacekeepers, or NATO. A militia is a citizen-based state institution of self-defense, similar in spirit to volunteer firefighters.
The Army of the United States exists by sufferance of Congress. The Navy of the United States, if we have a Navy in the United States, exists by the sufferance of Congress. The militia of the several states are not such. Their very existence is not even dependent on the Constitution of the United States, let alone the sufferance of Congress. So they have an independence and a locality. They are the original instruments of the exercise of the sovereign sword of the people of the United States.
Philosophically, the militia could be said to have originated 2,000 years ago with Mark 12:31 in the New Testament. Love thy neighbor as thyself. With this comes the idea of self-defense and the obligation to protect loved ones as well as citizens of the community.
In both Testaments, the Bible is replete with examples of good, godly men and women who resisted evil, wicked government, sometimes by force. The verse is often used where Simon Peter, in trying to defend Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, the Lord told Peter to put up his sword. He did not tell him to give up his sword. The Bible is absolutely replete with the principle of self-defense as being given to us by our Creator God. As Christians, we are not violence prone, but whenever those who are wicked and evil assert their power against us and attempt to take away the fundamental rights that our Creator God has given us, then they have crossed the line, and we have every right under God to defend ourselves, our families, our community, our liberty, etc.
Sir William Blackstone, the founder's legal mentor, argued that the right to self-defense was meaningless unless the citizen was able to effectuate that self-defense.
The right of self-defense is inherent in the natural rights of men. These rights are granted by the Creator. Now, the only way you can maintain your life in this world where there's a lot of evil is very often to engage in vigorous self-defense in the protection of yourself, your family, your property, your home, your country.
It's thus only natural that the earliest colonies would carry forward these principles. In fact, just about every one of the 13 colonies had a militia in one form or another, even 150 years before the Constitution was drafted.
The militia were active in the American colonies from the very beginning. If you look at every colonial charters where the king granted certain powers to his favorites to go over to North America and set up some kind of colony, he always directed them to form what later became militia, to arm and train all of the inhabitants of these plantations, as they were called. War of Independence comes, the states are no longer colonies, they continue with their militia structures. The Constitution is ratified and it incorporates the militia of the several states. And Congress, in fact, is required to organize, arm, discipline, and provide for the training of the militia and to call them forth for certain purposes of the general government of the United States. So Congress cannot remove them from the system. So they're permanent parts of the structure in the same way that Congress, the President, the Supreme Court, and the states are permanent parts of the structure.
The militia in most states continued on for another 150 until they were phased out by the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us about.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
We have a national emergency, something going on. Central authority or federal government takes over and brings in all of the militia from the states, forms them into a giant army that is then used against, in the case of the Civil War, the rebels in the South. But then after the war is over, these armies continue to exist. And they weren't gonna, because they keep saying, well, we have threat to the nation. The threat's still there.
So the threat's bigger than ever. The other problem we've got is the proliferation of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction.
So they always keep you on tether hooks by suggesting that there's always this threat out there to the nation that may not be as bad as government wants you to believe.
The framers were very sensitive to the danger of a standing army. They had just fought off the tyranny of the king's standing army. And so they did not want to see their new government with a continuing army.
Given this history, it is easy to see that the militia not only predates the states, but predates the United States as well. This is why the Constitution doesn't bother to specifically define the word militia. In 1776, everyone knew what the militia were.
Today, most people are convinced the militia is the U.S. government running the state National Guard, and which is not the militia. The militia means that people should have their own weapons and defend themselves, and it's sort of an amplification of, say, local sheriffs with posses defending their local turf.
The only thing that's even resembling the militia are sheriffs who understand the Constitution, which puts strong limits on what the federal government can do, and who are using their posses and their deputies to stand between the federal government and the people of their counties.